Good morning, everybody. This morning, my talk is going to be on what role for science in understanding, reducing, and managing disaster risk. And my outline, the outline of my talk is built around key areas. First of all, I will take you through very briefly about disaster trends over the last 20 years, and also what are the disaster risk and associated drivers. And then I will briefly cover the science and technology role in disaster risk reduction, followed by a brief introduction to the global frameworks associated with disaster risk reduction. And then I will take you through some of the examples in which science and technology has played a major role in disaster risk reduction, followed by challenges associated with that process and also opportunities available to us in this very important area. So just to start with, what is a disaster? A disaster can be described as a situation or event which overwhelms local capacity, necessitating a request to national or international level for external assistance, an unforeseen and often sudden event that causes great damage, destruction, and human suffering. This is actually a very brief outline to say what a disaster is all about. So if you move on to mega disasters, a mega disaster is an event that kills more than 100,000 people. 3 mega disasters occurred in the period 2000 to 2019, and they are the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the 2008 cyclone Nagis in Myanmar, and 2010 Haiti earthquake. And other massive casualty events include the 2003 heat waves in Europe, which actually killed 72,200 people. Over the last 20 years, 7,348 disaster events, to be precise, were recorded worldwide. In total, disaster claimed approximately 1.23 million lives, an average of 60,000 per annum, and affected a total of over 4 billion people. Additionally, disasters led to approximately US dollars 2.97 trillion in economic losses worldwide. And also there's clear evidence that in a world where the global average temperature in 2019 was 1.1 centigrade above the pre-industrial period, the impacts are being felt in the increased frequency of extreme weather events, including heat waves, droughts, flooding, winter storms, hurricanes, and wildfires. While improvements have been made in terms of early warnings, disaster preparedness and response, which have led to a reduction in loss of life in a single hazard scenarios, it is also clear that the increasing seismic nature of disaster risk, that is the overlap of events and the interplay between disaster drivers such as poverty, climate change, air pollution, population growth, and hazard-exposed areas, uncontrolled urbanization, and the loss of biodiversity requires greater strengthening of disaster risk governance. Asia actually suffered the highest number of disaster events. In total, between 2000 to 2019, there were 3,068 disaster events in Asia, followed by 1,756 events in Americas and 1,192 events in Africa. The high frequency and impact of disasters in Asia is largely due to the size of the continent and landscapes that represent a high risk of natural hazards, such as river basins, floodplains, and seismic fault lines. Additionally, there are high population densities in many disaster-prone areas of the continent. Worldwide, floods are the most common type of disasters, accounting for 44% of total events. Floods are hydrological events, a disaster subgroup that also includes landslides, which are responsible for 5% of the total events. Overall, the number of disaster events per year and the distribution of disaster subgroups has remained relatively stable between the year 2000 to 2019, with an average of 367 recorded events per year. This figure indicates the total number of people affected worldwide by disasters in the past 20 years by year. The most impactful year was 2002, with 658 million people affected, and in 2015, with 430 million people affected. The human cost of disasters depend on multiple factors, including the type of hazard, its location, duration, and the size and vulnerability of the population in harm's way. Given the intensification of many environmental hazards and their complex interactions, risk reduction strategies and risk-informed decision-making cannot afford to ignore their integrated, multi-scale, multiplier events. Both of these years were partly shaped by widespread droughts in India, which affected over 300 million people each year. Losses totaling US dollars $2.997 trillion were recorded from disasters between 2000 to 2019. However, this figure is an underestimation given underreporting of losses worldwide. If we to move on to the drivers behind these disasters, current global population stands at 7.3 billion as we speak. Other scientists have estimated there is an 85% chance that the people living the planet will taper to about 8.4 billion by the year 2100. Assumptions on fertility rates can, for example, lead to significant changes across these forecasts. So global population, global urban population is 67%, is predicted as 67% by 2050. And 50% of this urban population growth will be in just 7 countries. And the countries are India, China, Nigeria, Indonesia, the USA, Pakistan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Obviously, the dense concentration of people means that a hazard that strikes a city will affect large numbers of people. Disasters can spread rapidly and people can be highly dependent on infrastructure which may fail. Urban bureaucracies and more heterogeneous communities can limit the ability of traditional community units to plan for disasters. If we take the Sri Lankan situation, Sri Lanka ranks as the 5th least urbanized country out of 223 countries, according to the UN's 2014 World Urbanization Prospects, which is a marginally lower urban to rural population ratio than in St. Lucia and South Sudan. Officially, only around 18% of Sri Lankans live in an urban area, or around 3.9 million out of the country's 21.2 million population, according to World Bank data. Almost 3/4 of urban population people live in low and middle income countries. Outward urban and economic development generate new patterns of extensive risk, such as flooding and other weather-related hazards, particularly affecting informal settlements on the periphery of large cities as well as in small and medium-sized urban centers. Then there is weak governance. Mismatch between disaster risk reduction concerns and potential economic gain when developed decisions are made needs to take into consideration. Then, of course, global warming. Today, current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are higher than at any time during the last 800,000 years. The UK is among the countries with the greatest risk to their economic output from flooding, behind only to the US, China, India, Bangladesh, Germany, and Japan. Of course, there are many other drivers for disaster risk, such as technology, dependence on critical infrastructure, conflict and instability, globalization, and supply chain interdependencies. So what does this mean? The net effect of these drivers is very complex, but if not addressed, disaster risk will increase as a result of predetermined trends in the global environment and demography. So if we move on to the role of science and technology in this equation, science and technology are accelerants of progress. They create new insights and methods, solve all problems, and establish high standards and better evidence-based policies. More sound scientific research and evidence-based information is needed to increase the understanding of the underlying causes of disaster risk and losses that are affecting development gains. So throughout the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction negotiations and discussions process, major groups, including science and technology in partnership with regional and global platforms, have identified priority areas for action. This supportive work has been met with an overwhelming call by the governments across the world to actively strengthen the relationship between science, technology, innovation, knowledge management, and research to assist in informing policymaking and practice. While there are many challenges, including the complexity of the risk associated with disasters, terminology that is diverse and often overlapping, the difficulty in prioritization of targets and issues in aligning global, national and local indicators, there is a clear case for continuing uptake and integration of science into practice to deliver more effective policies. If we move on to understanding what Sendai framework is all about, adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction clearly recognizes that disaster risk management needs to be about managing the risk inherent in social and economic activity, rather than simply mainstreaming disaster risk management to protect against external threats like natural hazards. UNDRR recognizes that the inability to understand and manage seismic risk is a challenge for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we move the discussion on to the role of science in Sendai framework, I think it is fair to say that science is in the heart of Sendai. The role of science is formalized in the first of the Sendai framework's 4 priority areas, understanding disaster risk. It includes unprecedented emphasis on the role of science in understanding and delivering risk reduction. This ambition goes beyond the capacity of any one science approach, requiring to work hard on developing multidisciplinary agenda. So if we move on to some of the examples where use of science and technologies is very visible in managing a disaster risk. The first example I want to share with you is the Thames Barrier in London. The Thames Barrier is a movable flood barrier in the River Thames east of central London. It has been operational since 1984 and prevents the floodplain of all but the eastmost boroughs of Greater London from being flooded by exceptionally high tides and storm surges moving up from the North Sea. When needed, it is closed during a high tide. At low tide, it can be opened to restore the river's flow towards the sea. If we move on to an example in the Netherlands, a long-term $3 billion program entitled Room for the River is undertaking dozens of infrastructure projects to mitigate the likely impacts of climate change and to support development that reduces flood risk and negative environment impacts. In Bangladesh, a national flood warning system provides warnings up to 10 days ahead to millions of villagers, helping them defend against the regular flooding and preserve household assets. Studies indicate savings of about $40 for every dollar invested. In China, flooding in 1931 and 1959 caused millions of fatalities, but now with early warning and evacuation systems as part of risk reduction policies, such great loss of life no longer occurs. China has implemented, based on scientific understanding of temporal and spatial variation of hazards and risk, warning and comprehensive national and regional 5-year plans for disaster risk reduction evacuation systems. If we see to move on to Japan, lying on the ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean, Japan is prone to major earthquakes. Scientific study of ground movements before and during earthquakes led to the discovery of 2 different types of seismic wave that transmit an earthquake's energy through the ground. Scientists have used this understanding to develop better and better monitoring, sensitive measurements and instruments. In New Zealand, the severe 2011 Christchurch earthquake confirmed the benefits of national building codes and property insurance. But scientific knowledge on soil liquidation had been neglected in planning laws, resulting in billions of dollars damage to houses and infrastructure. If we sort of move on to the agenda for science and policy community on disaster risk reduction initiatives, use of holistic, all hazard, risk-based and problem-solving approach is quite important. And also there's a need to conduct a periodic review of knowledge needs. And also there's a need to support open access, multi-hazard data platforms and standardized approaches. Scientists and researchers must work with policymakers, and users must be included in the earlier stages in developing research and methodologies. Scientific advice to decision makers through close collaboration and dialogue is very much a necessity. So I suppose if we sort of move on to the challenges associated with lack of progress in terms of science and technology in disaster risk reduction. Several countries identify their lack of progress on the role of science and technology in DRR to a lack of the necessary technical, financial and human resources, inadequate institutional mechanisms included. And also integrating risk reduction and climate change adaptation is always a challenge. If we move on to finances, public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures need to be stepped up to create disaster resilient societies. The concentrated impact due to single disaster type in some countries provides an opportunity for a more focused approach on disaster risk reduction. However, COVID-19 demonstrates the need for a systematic multi-hazard approach in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world that we live in. Okay, so we talk about challenges associated with science and technology integration within the DRR sector. So let's, the next section that I want to emphasize is on what are the opportunities for higher education sector and science in this scenario. So I see there are various dimensions that we can concentrate on as far as opportunities for science is concerned. So the first one is link research, education and action. And the second one is integrate all hazards, stakeholders and disciplines. And the third one is collaborate regionally and globally. And the fourth option is facilitate policy dialogue, knowledge sharing and capacity development. And finally, develop flexible, customizable education programs. So I will very briefly take you through all these opportunities one after the other. So if you sort of take the first one, for example, the link research, education and action. In my view, the prime focus must be that the policy science gap is closed with research that can be translated to action. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And research studies document a trend of increasing disaster losses, but the translation of research findings into practical action has proven difficult and remains a barrier that prevents the best use of science. So by doing the documentation, we will be able to overcome that obstacle. So there remains a recognized need for higher education through researchers and educators to provide and communicate actionable knowledge with explicit link to inform effective evidence-based decision making. As well as creating new knowledge, higher education has a vital role to play, in my view, in capacity development, and in doing so, providing a means by which effective knowledge transfer can take place. So if you move on to the second opportunity area, there's an opportunity for us to integrate all hazards, stakeholders, and disciplines. For example, we can have a multidisciplinary approach and also the multi-stakeholder approach. For example, just sharing my own experiences. Nowadays, it is very, very common that different experts who belong to different fields actually come together to solve common problems, including that are related to disasters. So maybe 20 years ago, I wouldn't have ever imagined that I will work with historians, geographers, sociologists, and the medical professionals. But that is what we all are doing at the moment. So it is actually very much kind of multidisciplinary and also practicing multi-stakeholder approach. And also in that sense, we are taking a lot of effort to address problems from the field and thereby to calibrate solutions. So if you move on to the next opportunity, of course, there are major opportunities in front of us to collaborate regionally and globally. For example, in that sense, I think there's a need for us to continue regional global initiatives that promote collaboration. And I see there's a greater increase in the extent and the level of collaboration in the recent past. So in that sense, international cooperation and global partnership is really, really important. In that sense, the current regional networks can collaborate to form a global higher education network, for example, providing a kind of a coordination mechanism for science. So if we actually sort of move on to another key area where there's an opportunity for all of us, it is actually facilitate policy dialogue, knowledge sharing, and capacity development. So I'm going to cover this under 5 key areas. So for example, if we actually sort of take the first one, greater opportunity should be put on sharing and disseminating science information. The research community must take more effort to translate traditional outputs into practical methods, in my view, that can readily be integrated into policies, regulations, and implementation plans towards disaster risk reduction. In that sense, there can be national research assessment exercises provided by the national funding bodies and higher education institutions, which often emphasize traditional academic outputs. So there can be new mechanisms to do the assessments. So if you sort of move on to the second point, which is on open access, in my view, the recent shift towards open access of research outputs and education is to be welcomed and should continue to be encouraged and promoted. The high levels of disaster risk found in low-income countries make it an imperative that global research and education is made widely available so that everybody will have access to the new state-of-the-art. This includes the use of green publishing routes where possible, or promoting financial support to do the open access. In that sense, the higher education should be supported to develop open educational resources that are freely accessible and openly licensed for use in teaching, learning, research, and also by means of providing access to the policymakers. So the next point is the aggregator of knowledge to improve access and focus on quality. So what matters here is actually not the quantity of products that we do, but the quality of the outputs, which will add to expand in the state-of-the-art knowledge. So the final point that I want to emphasize here is understanding language of policymakers, which is very, very important. Educators and the research community must take time and effort, in my view, to understand the audience that they are seeking to inform. For example, I think you will agree with me when we take the scientific results are often subject to misunderstanding due to poor comprehension of numbers and statistics in most of the situations, as well as conflicting language and terminology. So in that sense, correct comprehension depends not only on the skills and knowledge of the reader, but also on the way the information is presented. By assuming a weaker background knowledge and low statistical literacy, evidence summarizers can add information to help readers better understand the scientific information, in my view. So if you sort of move on to the next area, for example, develop flexible and customizable education program. So in my view, there is an expanding field of disaster management, but simultaneously, in my view, a lack of young professionals with appropriate skills and knowledge to support the building of resilience within the relevant stakeholders. So in that sense, there is a need to maintain and expand the network of key persons, including change agents and facilitators. And higher education in that sense must develop flexible and customized programs rather than actually repeating the same process year after year, and curricula, whether a module in regular master's or undergraduate curriculum or a dedicated postgraduate program. So the learning mechanisms needs to be updated on regular basis. So in that sense, there need to be detailed market research to understand the needs and interest in potential studies with clear linkages to future job markets. So in that sense, developing flexible and customized programs is extremely important. So these are some of the key opportunities that I want to emphasize, where I have covered 5 key points. So just in concluding my talk about the role of science in disaster risk reduction, I want to sort of emphasize few points here, as I have included in this slide. Natural and man-made hazards threaten millions of people every year and cause billions of property damage. Disasters continue to undermine sustainable development, so reducing its impact and identifying pathways towards resilient societies is a global goal. But how much do we know about them? Scientists and researchers have brought a deeper understanding of the hazards, vulnerabilities, disaster risk, and their linkages to the development processes. Science plays a key role in preventing disasters, preparing for the ones that cannot be prevented, and recovering from them. So we all need to be very mindful about that particular point. So in that sense, science and technology can assist in identifying a problem, developing understanding from research, informing policy and practice, and making a difference that can be objectively demonstrated when evaluated. And also it will help us to deepen our understanding of evolving risk, the root causes of disasters and their impacts. Actionable research that is useful is needed, and usable and used. That is very, very important. Scientists and researchers have to work together with policymakers and practitioners, including community and the civil society, as well as government actors, to co-design and co-produce research that can be used effectively. So that is very, very important as well. So in that sense, there is a need to be scientific advice to decision makers through close collaboration and dialogue, with more focused attention on interlinkages between disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. So in that sense, it is fair to say that there is a need to use a holistic, all-hazard and problem-solving approach to address the multifactorial and interdependent nature of disaster risk chain, and to achieve improved disaster risk reduction. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that I have communicated the message to say the role that science and technology plays in reducing disasters in the world that we all live in. Thank you very much.